Hi, it's Christy. Welcome back to part 2 of my sew along for Simplicity 1618. In the last video, I selected the fabric and cut the fabric. If your fabric's all cut, the next part is to sew. And if you follow the instructions in the pattern, you'll go facing, 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 shoulder seams, shoulder seams, shoulder seams. I don't find that that is the best way to work. With my background in tutoring and education, there is a term called chunking, where you chunk groups of work together so you can work more efficiently. And applying this idea to sewing, I think, is really helpful. In this video, I'm going to cover how to do French seams. We'll do French seams on the center back and the side seams, and also the two sections of the shoulder. And this is really nice. I don't have a serger, and I don't like just a zigzag edge unless it's really unavoidable because it's ugly and it frays in the wash and it bothers me. So French seams are also really strong. You get a row of stitching and then you trim it and then you turn it again and you get 2 rows of stitching. So all the raw edges are enclosed and there's double stitching, so it's not going to rip or anything, and you preserve the seam allowance in there in case you need to alter it later. There's a good seam allowance in there. Another technique I'm going to use is turning twice and top stitching, and that is for the 2 half circles on each shoulder, front and back. So there's 4 spots where you turn, press, pin, and stitch. And for this part, it's easier to sew from the inside so that you can see the fold and get your needle to catch every bit of the fabric. If you're a more experienced seamstress or sewer, you can sew from the top and you can feel when you pass the fabric through that you're hitting the needle. Even I will skip a stitch sometime, and usually, you can leave, if just one stitch has missed, you can leave that and you don't have to go back and seam rip the whole thing. Because seam ripping can be discouraging and it can be time consuming. So I always think if it's all the same, white thread on a white shirt, go ahead and do it from the inside. Get it done, feel like you've accomplished it, and call it a day. Stay stitching maintains the shape of the neck hole while you're working on other parts of the shirt so that it doesn't get warped. It also can act like a guide when you're attaching the facing piece to the bodice at the neck. The next part is to stitch the center back seam for the French seams. French seams, as I explained, are 2 rows of stitching, and then the first one, wrong sides need to be together. So this fabric is pretty much reversible, but usually fabric has a very clear right side and wrong side. Sometimes it's just there's a print only printed on one side, or sometimes there's a sheen on one side or a special finish. In this case, it's pretty reversible, but yes, you start with wrong sides together. It's important to note your right sides and wrong sides so you don't end up sometimes with like 2 left sleeves. My sew along is not going to look like a sew along from the pattern maker's point of view, where you're following the bullet pointed list that they give you in the pattern instructions. I find it's more effective to work in chunks. So you're sitting at the sewing machine and sewing disparate parts of the pattern at one time, and then moving to the pressing a big chunk together, and then coming back to sewing. So when you have French seams, you have to sew the seam twice. You have to sew once and then press it so that it looks nice, and then trim it, and then you put right sides together and do your final seam. So the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance is broken into a 1/4 inch, press, clip, and then turn it again and to another 3/8 of an inch seam. And that is your total 5/8 of an inch seam, just sewed in 2 separate passes at the machine. The pattern indicated to only use French seams on the shoulders. That's because right in the armpit, there's an opportunity for it to pucker when you come around the corner. But I find that really it's in the armpit, you can't see it, and I'm totally comfortable with French seams. So that's my preferred method. I almost always use French seams if I can. Once I attach the fusible interfacing to the wrong side of the facing pieces, I used a zigzag on the bottom edge, which is the wider edge. And that way, if the fusible comes unfused for any reason, too hot of a washing machine or whatever, the zigzag will hold it on and you'll keep that nice weight and everything. The next thing to do with this pressing board is to press the center back seam allowance. Now, I might press a little bit too much, but I always learned when you're doing French seams to press the whole thing to the right, the whole seam allowance to the right, that whole 1/4 inch. And then once it's pressed to the right, then you run the iron the other way and you press the whole thing to the left. And then you flip it so that right sides are together, the way it's gonna actually be finished. I don't have a serger machine, which means I don't have finished edges on the pattern piece like a store-bought top would. I often use French seams to encase the raw edges, and this is how I chose to finish the seams on this top. Center back, side seams, and shoulder seams. Remember, this top did have a center front seam that I removed, so if you're completing this with a center front seam, you'll also want to put a French seam there. So once I was done with cutting, this top took me about an hour and a half. Half the time was spent pinning and pressing, and the other half was spent sewing. The other seam finish used in this top is a basic straight stitch that's used on the cold shoulder and the hem and the sleeves. This is turning twice and stitching. Usually I do it all at once at the ironing board, although the pattern will often recommend turning the finished edge first, pressing, and then turning the remainder under. So you would, if it's a 5/8 of an inch seam, the pattern's gonna recommend you press it 5/8 of an inch and then turn the little bit under a second time. I actually just turn it twice. My eyes, after sewing for so long, I'm really good at estimating what's a 1/4 inch. When you turn a 1/4 inch twice, there's usually a little bit of a smidge of extra fabric in there, and you'll catch that 5/8 of an inch. I'm using cotton, so I'm using a really hot setting. Watch out for your fingers. The ironing board has metal in it, and that'll get hot and stay hot when the shirt is no longer hot. So even just holding the ironing board sometimes can burn your fingers. The last thing to do is to use the iron and turn the cold shoulder detail. You want to turn it once, turn it twice, and then pin it. Now that I've got a whole chunk of things ready to sew, I'm moving back to the sewing machine. Okay, first thing, overcast these zigzag edges of the facing. And once those are zigzag, pin them together at 5/8 of an inch. And now, once those are sewed, we're ready to press the seam allowances open, which is called busted, which I think is a fun name. Okay, so facing is done. Now to sew the cold shoulder half circles. You can stitch it from the fashion side if you're confident in your sewing skills and you've done this before. I actually messed up when I was doing it and had a seam rip. I didn't show you that in the video because I didn't think it was very fun. I didn't want this video to be incredibly long. I debated whether to truly show on fast forward everything I did at the machine, and I decided it was super boring. So I ended up sewing the cold shoulder detail from the inside. You can see that your needle's catching. You can go really slow and just make sure you get it. Finally, your center back French seam is all pinned, so you're gonna sew this at 3/8 of an inch and be done with the center back seam. If you were going to do this as the pattern instructed with the center front seam, you would be doing the center front seam exactly along with the center back seam. So the first time you sit at the sewing machine, sew the center front seam and press it and trim it exactly the same at the same time on the first pass at the ironing board. And now that you're here, you'd also be finishing the center front seam. We can go ahead and move on to the underarm side seams for the French seams. So wrong sides together, pin them, sew it 1/4 inch under each arm. This is the first stitching line for the French seams. Now that the cold shoulder detail is done, you can also pin the seams together at 1/4 inch at the top shoulders. There are 2 different sections to pin because the cold shoulder breaks up that shoulder seam, but as you can see, you just pin it at 1/4 inch and it's easy. Once the facing is attached, you also have to do understitching, which is a stitching line very close to the seam around the neck, and you do it on the inside. So it's actually stitched on the facing. It goes through 3 layers of fabric. It goes through the facing seam allowance, the top neckline seam allowance, and the facing itself. And it holds down really nicely the shirt so that you don't have it rolling up, and it keeps it flat along your neckline. Back to the sewing machine for sewing chunk 3. You want to finish the side seams and the shoulder seams with the 3/8 inch French seam. Now what you have is a shirt that is finished on the shoulder seams, the cold shoulder is finished, and the side seams are finished. Center back is finished. I have center front on a fold. If you're doing center front is finished. You also have a separate little circle that is the neckline facing piece. So here's the shirt. I just pressed the cold shoulder, so it's laying flatter. When you're sewing, pressing is really more important than sewing. You can fix a lot with just good pressing. So then after I stitched this, I stitched the raw edge. Here, I'll show the hem. I stitched the raw edge at 1/4 inch. And then go around and use the thread as a little bit of weight. And use the thread line. Again, it's on basting, so that means like the longest stitch that your sewing machine can do on a straight stitch. So go around and baste it and then press it. Now it's turned once with the stitching line on the edge. After you go around the whole hem, do it again. This is like the hardest part because this is where the curve is. And the steam button or squirting water is what kind of bends the threads, breaks the threads, and makes them stay put. So now the thread basting line is here, and I'm going to stitch right here on my hem and sleeve. Another technique you can use to finish hems is to baste the seam allowance. So if it's a 1-inch hem, you sit down at the machine and with your longest stitch, no back stitches, because you want to be able to pull it out easily when you're done, you use your longest stitch, and at 1 inch, just parallel to the edge of the fabric, you stitch. And then when you come to the sewing machine, you fold that using the thread as a guide of where your fold is going to be. Here's the final finished shirt. So here is the shoulder seam with the cold shoulder detail and the hem. And here are the French seams. No raw edges. And here they go along the sides. So you can see through them a little bit. You can see where the fabric's been trimmed to 1/8 of an inch. And here's my 3/8 of an inch seam. That's the outside of it. And here's the hem. Here's the neckline. It lays really nice. Oh, missed a thread. There we go. And here's understitching. Goes all the way around on the inside. When you're sewing it, you press it like this. So you press the seam allowances this way. And then when you go to the machine, you have just the shirt here and the other 3 layers of fabric. You stitch very close. Here's the zigzag edge. So if I didn't do French seams, this is what the inside of my whole shirt would look like, and I hate it. I have it here because anything else would be adding bulk on the neckline. It's really the only option here. It's not that bad, I mean. But I just don't see that it saves any time. You're gonna zigzag the whole fabric. You might as well just do the French seam. I think it actually might take longer because you have to zigzag this. You have to zigzag this piece of fabric and this piece of fabric, and then you sew it together. So it actually, in my mind, takes twice as long than just one straight stitch. Zigzag takes longer than a straight stitch. And you have to zigzag every single pattern piece. Here's my tack, where I tack down right through the center back. And also the shoulder seam so that it doesn't pull up. Just it's nice. And then see this triangle? That's clipping. There's about 5 spots that you have to clip the neckline to get it to lay really nice. Pretty much where there's a curve. So clip a triangle out here and here and here and here and here and here.